Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session on water and armed conflict as part of the suite of seminars that run as a backbone during this year's Water Week under its broader theme of water, peace, and security. Just by way of context of what we're engaging, we are walking through a series of seminars to examine the concept of peace and security with the issues associated with water and the challenges it brings around conflict and challenge in the world, and then organizing with that understanding of that problematique to further examine, more importantly, how water can be an important element of solution around conflict to engage a higher precipitant of peace and security in the world. My name is Desikan Naidu. I am a member of the Scientific Program Committee, and I will be chairing this session today, and all of our panelists and our moderator will soon be introduced to you. So just to expand that introduction, the reality is that although we've been talking about sometime deep into the future, where the Third World War will in fact be precipitated around the issues of water, the reality is we have been fighting about water throughout human history. The human story on Earth is a story of conflict by and large, and water has been a central pillar of that for the longest time. And in this context, in this conflict around water, armed conflict and violence is one of the most extreme expressions of that water challenge. And the reality is we are living in a more conflict-ridden world than we have for quite a long time. There are epicenters of conflict around the world that are not just defining the nature of what is happening in those geographies, it is defining almost every aspect of human life on Earth. And to pull out three epicenters, and there are many more, and we know that, we have the Sudanese conflict, that is the center of a larger conflict around Central and Eastern Africa, and is dominating the politics of the continent. We have a devastating war in Gaza, which has extended to the World Bank, which has the greatest potential to go beyond that into Lebanon and perhaps even further into the Middle East as we speak. And another epicenter closest geographically to where we are talking to you from today is the war in Ukraine, which similarly has organized itself to significantly alter both the texture of international relations and the kinds of conversations we are having in that regard. If this isn't enough, water insecurity in the world in general is talking to the issue of inequitable availability and access. And the threat multiplier factor that comes on the back of climate change has become more stark than ever before. In fact, it's fair to say that although one should hang on to the dream of plus 1.5 degrees by the turn of the century, it does not seem that viable. The audited figures for 2023 is telling us that the 2023 year for the world as a whole was already at plus 1.48 degrees. In some parts of the world, like the Caribbean, it's even higher than that at 1.64. So this multiplier effect of climate change has increased this risk incredibly exponentially. So what this seminar in its three sessions is going to examine the relationship between water and armed conflict, expanding out that problematique, and indeed organizing for us to think about the solutions associated with that. So if we move to the next slide, what we have done is offer this in these three sessions. Today's session will examine peace and security. The session later this afternoon at 2 will examine this from the perspective of a social and humanitarian lens. And tomorrow, we will have the wrap-up session after having a deep dive into economic resilience and sustainability. A brief intro to today's session on the next slide is that we're first going to start with a keynote address, and then going to hand over to Fonte Yakum to run us through a panel, and there will be an opportunity in that panel session for a Q&A for all of the folk who are joining us online, and then we will draw this into a conclusion. So, colleagues, I think without further ado, I'm going to hand over directly now to Fonte Yakum to get us into the panel session, and he will introduce our esteemed panelists today. And we're delighted to have some of the thought leaders, both in the water world and in the world of climate change and in the world of conflict and security. Fonte, over to you.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm Fonte Yakum, the Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies. Allow me to welcome you to the first session of the World Water Week seminar series on water and armed conflict. As Des again duly noted, this session focuses on peace and security perspectives. Des again spoke to the Ukraine crisis, but for the Ukraine crisis, I would evoke the Black Sea Grain Initiative as the centerpiece of water diplomacy in order to allow access to the Ukrainian port to deal with a global food security crisis that was triggered by that crisis. He also related to the ongoing war in Gaza, which has greatly impacted water access, exacerbating an already critical humanitarian crisis. While these are more temporally proximate examples, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, or the issues around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project reflect the centrality of water to public health, environmental stability, peace, and security. Hence, the very importance and salience of this convening. The reality of violent extremism around the Lake Chad Basin, a body of water, cannot escape our perspectives as well. I would therefore encourage a conversation among the panelists that arches from a shared understanding of the problems to the heart of the mechanics that allow us to navigate water and conflict crisis to resolution. We will certainly get to the opening, the keynote by Barbara Schreiner as well. But for this particular discussion, I am joined by an esteemed panel, and I would like to welcome, without providing a detailed introduction, Her Excellency Akissa Bakri, former Minister of Agriculture, Water Resources and Fisheries of Tunisia. I would also like to welcome Hauhelum Kumeni, Research Officer at the Institute for Security Studies, and Julia McQuaid, Acting Vice President and Director at the Center for Naval Analysis. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, here are the rules of engagement. I'd provide 5 minutes for each of our distinguished panelists to frame their reflections based on the positions from which they speak and the backgrounds that they bring to this conversation on water and conflict. Following their liminal remarks, I would engage with them to dig deeper into some of their reflections, and then open up for a 12-minute conversation during which we would absolutely be delighted to welcome interventions from the floor. And our colleagues, Martin and Ludmila, would help us navigate that Q&A process, following which we would actually go back to our panelists to provide us with their final parting shots in 2 short minutes. So, without further ado, I look to Akissa. Akissa, you had the complex task of managing agriculture, fisheries, and water resources for Tunisia. We know that agriculture is really important to Tunisia's economy. I'd like to turn to you based on your experience to talk us through your reflections on water and conflict in the current global context. Thank you very much, Akisa. Over to you. Akisa, I think you're muted.
Excuse me. So thank you, Fonte, and I would like to follow up on what Desigan was saying regarding, and what you were saying about the ongoing dispute in different parts of the world over control and access to scarce water resources. And we see a number of attacks on water systems where war and violence are widespread. And according to the Pacific Institute, violence over water is worsening. There was a significant increase in the number of violent conflicts over water in 2023. And the growing water crisis poses a threat to livelihoods, ecosystems, and security. So is it possible to prevent escalation of water-related tensions into conflict? Is it possible to enhance collaboration among stakeholders, turning water-related threats into water-related opportunities for sustainable water management and peace building? One thing that is important to remind that water is a political resource, and the management of rivers is always political. Water security is essential for political security, but also the politics of water can be highly emotional. And I'm going to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war in Gaza. From the foundation of the State of Israel, access to water resources has been as central to the nation's conflict with the Palestinian people as competing claims to land. All water resources are under Israel's control. It uses over 80% of the Palestinian groundwater, prohibits well construction, and destroys water harvesting tanks. Palestinians spend 33% of their annual income on water. Israel has implemented a structural water apartheid in Palestine, using water grabbing to dispossess Palestinians of their land and ways of life, impeding Palestinian agriculture in the West Bank. The Oslo Agreement paid no attention to the principle of fair and reasonable use of water resources. The definition of Palestinian rights was absent from the agreement. The basic principles that govern these rights and the obligation of both parties have not been established. By weaponizing water, Israel is desiccating Palestinian life. Palestinians are suffering from thirst and famine. It's a literal matter of life and death. Israeli forces have systematically destroyed Palestinian water treatment facilities, water supply wells, and water pipelines, forcing hospitals, refugee camps, and hundreds of thousands of residents to rely on highly contaminated or salty groundwater. Since October 2023, Israel is cutting off all means of life support. At some relief sites of displaced residents, 400 people share a single toilet. The human right to water is indispensable for leading a life in human dignity. And the cutting of water, food, and electricity supplies is a war crime. We are also witnessing, for the last 100 years, an ecocide and the use of food as a weapon. So by this time, the aim is not for Palestinians to go hungry, but to die from hunger. So what can we do and how we can move on this topic? Because I mean, there were the Oslo Agreement, but we have seen that the failure of the Oslo Agreement that shows that Israelis and Palestinians did not have the key prerequisite for learning their way out of conflict. That is a healthy basic trust. The focus of negotiation between parties is generally on material aspects of water security, ignoring the non-material emotional attachment. If the negotiations are to transform interaction and build a cooperative, returnized relationship, more time and resources should be spent on building trust, especially in constructing more compatible state identities. Can I have the first slide? There is the need to rethink the global approach to water conflict and move away from the traditional security and peace agenda. Security and peace should not be the primary goals of water diplomacy, rather equity and the development of a collective identity over shared water should. Identity is a centerpiece of security at the societal level and carries greater weight than sovereignty. When looking at water conflict, it's about dignity and how cooperation addresses their identity. It's about equity identity, justice, dignity, fairness, trust. It's about social security. What is needed is water conflict transformation by putting a new emphasis on equity identity, dealing more with the root causes of the conflict in order to engage with the parties and transform their interests, identities, and discourse collectively and create a shared understanding for a common future. Water conflict transformation is more linked to the ideas of fairness and justice that it is to management and resolution. And on the second slide, you can see that when we talk about peace and security, security and peace, yes, it's just the top of the iceberg. In fact, we have to really look at the creation of collective identity and equity assessment. So is a different future possible? I think so. It is not as easy as we would like. As scientists, engineers, regulator, manager, diplomats, politicians, we have an important role to play by offering solutions that can mitigate the stress point, by informing public officials, by reducing the risk of water conflicts. And there are a number of strategies that include technological, economic, political, diplomatic, and legal approaches and improving water management. Water can be part of the solution, and in many places it is a critical part. There is an essential need for solutions that offer equitable access to water and sanitation. Collaborative water management can be a building block for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. An alternative future grounded in a sense of shared humanity and respect is possible for the intertwined reality of Israelis and Palestinians. A clear political will to carry out a profound transformation, competing institutions, and strong scientific and political leadership and commitment are needed. And a global strategic perspective vision, which reflects the balance between the economy, the social, the environment, and the politics is also required. A paradigm shift is required for pro-equity identity water diplomacy. And as Martin Luther King said, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akisa. I would not go through the different points in your presentation, which were absolutely clear and succinct. But I would like to focus on the issue of the political nature of the water issue, but also the key perspectives that you bring about addressing the root causes of water conflict. If you would permit me, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my attention has just been called to the fact that we had to take the keynote before getting into the panel conversation. So I crave your indulgence and with due apologies to Barbara Schreiner, who was supposed to provide the keynote address, I would go back in reverse before we come back to the other members of the panel. So thank you, Daisy, again, and I'd like to welcome Barbara Schreiner with the Water Integrity Institute to take 10 minutes to provide her opening remarks as well. Thank you very much, Barbara, and thanks for your patience as well.
Thanks very much, Fonte, and thank you, Akisa, for those very powerful words that also very much helped to set the scene. This is a very timely and important topic. And Des, you talked about sort of fighting about water and the possibility of conflict about water, but we also need to talk very much about fighting with water, because both are elements of this issue of conflict around water. So and going back to what you were saying, Des, in terms of expanding the problematique, I want to talk just a little bit about what I see as a toxic triangle between three C's, between corruption, climate change, and conflict, and the impact of that relationship on water security, whether it's water security at the household, at the local, or at the national or even international level. So I'll start from what is actually a very well-recognized relationship, which is that corruption fuels conflict, and corruption is enabled by conflict. There is a very toxic relationship between corruption and conflict. Corruption is a driver of fragility. It undermines stability and democracy. This in turn fuels conflict and creates deliberately undermined and captured institutions. It's important to recognize both corruption and conflict deliberately create weak institutions. They're not the result of weak institutions. They create weak institutions. Corrupt actors may use tax evasion, collusion and corruption in procurement, subpar construction of public projects, or the unjust distribution of public resources to achieve their ends. They often exacerbate water insecurity in conflict zones by diverting resources and undermining infrastructure development. All of this serves to undermine the legitimacy of government and the social contract between the state and the people, and the potential for increased violence, conflict and violence. Most of us in this conversation today think that water is the most important thing in the world, and of course it is. But we also need to look at the world within which water is managed, outside the water sector. And that includes in the context of armed conflict and corruption. More than 40% of global corruption originates in the global arms trade, a trade that is very poorly monitored and controlled. According to the 2020 Government Defence Integrity Index from Transparency International in the UK, nearly 2/3 of the countries they surveyed face a high to critical risk of corruption in their defence and security sectors. And the same countries that score poorly in this index are more likely to experience conflict, instability, and human rights abuses. So we have a clearly toxic relationship between corruption and conflict. Now we introduce a third C into the picture, climate change. And there's, as you mentioned, climate change is a very present and very real threat to water security and to economic stability around the world. But it's also exacerbated by corruption and by organized crime, for example, in relation to massive deforestation. And climate change is exacerbating conflict. And as a result of climate change, we're seeing the massive displacement of mainly rural populations, most notably because of severe droughts, rising temperatures, and significant changes in rainfall patterns. The displacement of people as a result of climate change makes them increasingly vulnerable to violence and to conflict, with particular impacts for women and children. And this toxic triangle has horrible impacts on water security. The impacts may come through the deliberate destruction or withholding of water from a population, as Akissa talked about in the Gazan genocide, where Israel has radically cut the water supply to 2 million people. And as Akissa said, that's just one step in what has been a many decades process of using water as a tool of oppression against Palestinians. But we've seen it elsewhere too. In the 1991 Gulf War, the US deliberately targeted Iraq's water infrastructure, including dams, water treatment plants, and sewage facilities, in order to weaken Iraq by cutting off access to clean water. But the problem is that leads to widespread suffering amongst civilians, especially children. ISIS or Daesh have used the control of water infrastructure to exert power over populations in strategic areas. In Yemen, the ongoing war has seen water facilities targeted, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. In the Ukraine, we've seen similar, and as always, it is ordinary citizens that bear the brunt. But the water sector itself is not exempt from corruption. It's not a passive victim in this toxic triangle. Land and water grabbing is probably one of the most problematic areas in this regard. But equally, both climate change and conflict call for emergency measures to be put in place around water supply. And emergency and disaster situations increase the risk of corruption because the normal procurement measures are often waived in the interests of speedy delivery to affected populations, and that opens up the door for corruption. Armed conflicts mean devastating loss of civilian life, massive displacement, violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Corruption, conflict, and the weaponization of water all impact on innocent civilians separately and collectively, in a context where climate change is already substantially affecting people's access to water. Akili Mbembe uses the term necropolitics, which is the exercising of power to determine how some people live and how others must die. And this is what we're seeing in terms of the weaponization of water and the use of and abuse of water in the armed conflicts. After the horrors of the First and the Second World Wars, the world came together and put down some ground rules for war. I mean, it does seem bizarre to me, but there are ground rules for war. And they're captured in the Geneva Conventions and their protocols. And they fall under the rubric of international humanitarian law, which is a set of rules which seek, for humanitarian reasons, to limit the effects of armed conflict. It protects persons who are not or are no longer participating in hostilities and restricts the means and methods of warfare. And international humanitarian law has to be applied equally by all sides in every armed conflict, regardless of whether their cause is justified or not. Then we also have international human rights law, which is a system of international norms designed to protect and promote the human rights of everyone. These rights are inherent in everybody, regardless of your nationality, your religion, your ethnicity, your sex, your age, your language, any other criterion you can think of. You can't pick and choose who they apply to. Although we know that various states and governments seem quite willing to take this approach of picking who they apply to. This includes the human right to water. Human rights entail both rights and obligations. International human rights law sets out the obligations of states to act in particular ways or to refrain from certain acts. So international human rights law and international humanitarian law share the goal of preserving the dignity and humanity of all, even in conflict situations. Over the years, the General Assembly, the Commission on Human Rights, and more recently the Human Rights Council have considered that in armed conflict, parties to the conflict have legally binding obligations concerning the rights of persons affected by the conflict. Both bodies of law apply to situations of armed conflict and provide complementary and mutually reinforcing protection on paper. So under the laws of war, all parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harms to civilians and what is called civilian objects, such as residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and water infrastructure, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants, which cause disproportionate harm to civilians. Each party to an armed conflict is required to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law by all those acting on its instructions or under its direction or control. They have to respect international humanitarian law, even if their adversary does not. In other words, this is not something based on reciprocity. It is an obligation on any party to an armed conflict. And states are obliged to criminally prosecute persons that they suspect of committing such violations. And under certain conditions, alleged war criminals may also be referred to the International Criminal Court. So we have a toxic triangle of corruption, climate change, and conflict, which severely impacts on the human rights to water and threatens water security at the household, local, and national levels. And it's quite easy at this point to go, okay, it's big, it's too big, it's beyond us, what on earth can we do? But we can do stuff as water professionals. Akissa referred to the work by the Pacific Institute, who've been measuring water-related conflicts over the past 20 years, and showing that they have increased substantially over the past 20 years in quite a frightening way. They split the categorization of water conflicts into where water has been used as a weapon of war, where water is a casualty of conflict, and where water is a trigger for conflict. And it's a very useful categorization to get our heads around as people in the water sector. And each category, I think, calls for a different response from us. So where water is a trigger of conflict, better water governance may well serve to reduce the potential for conflict. So, for example, where we have armed clashes between pastoralists and herders in Kenya, better water management may be able to reduce that armed conflict. Where water is a casualty of war, we have a responsibility to speak out against and to keep pressure on the belligerents to avoid water and sanitation systems and to be prepared to step in with emergency responses to protect the rights of civilian populations. But we do need to advocate for stronger protection of water infrastructure in conflict zones. We should be pushing for increased transparency and anti-corruption measures in water management, including in conflict and humanitarian or disaster relief areas. Where water has been weaponized, we must speak out to hold the perpetrators to account. We must demand accountability for violations of international law regarding water rights. We must support organizations that are working to provide clean water in conflict zones and pressure governments to prioritize water security in foreign policy and in peacekeeping efforts. We need specific international legal frameworks to address the weaponization of water, and we need a monitoring and accountability system. While water is protected under international humanitarian law, there is currently little to no accountability for attacks that threaten access to it. In 2017, the World Health Organization surveillance system for attacks on healthcare was introduced. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a step towards documentation and accountability. I think we need a similar UN-based surveillance system for attacks on water bodies, water infrastructure, and supply systems for a process of accountability around this. I want to end with a quotation from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in last year. He said, "We must never lose sight of the meaning and purpose of international humanitarian law. It is the difference between life and death, between restraint and anarchy, between losing ourselves in horror and retaining our humanity. Civilians have suffered the deadly effects of armed conflict for too long. It is time we lived up to our promise to protect them. And it is time," and I'm no longer quoting him, "that we as professionals step up to the plate in this regard." And to reflect on what Akissa said, what we need is not just peace and security, but water justice and security. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Barbara, for those absolutely moving words that capture the toxic triangle. I think that framing actually provides us with a very useful entry point for engagement on issues of water and conflict, and ties in really nicely with how we approach durable solutions to these challenges. And here I would underline the necessity to bring to the fore and actually actualize the different legal obligations that exist at global level that have been domesticated as well within national and regional laws. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I hope we can make a very quick pivot back to the panel and then get to the question and answer session, because I'm sure, and Barbara, I hope you'd be staying along with us, I'm sure that there would be a robust conversation about most of the issues that have been raised already. Without further ado, I would like to turn now to Hauhelo Nkubeni. Hi, Hauhelo. I just want to turn to you to kind of shift the conversation towards youth. Often, the conversations about youth focus on the dimension which Barbara spoke about, that is youth as actors in conflicts related to water. However, I would like us to pivot and actually speak more to youth and their contributions to effectively addressing water conflict. Over to you, Hauhelo.
Thank you so much, Fonte. I would like to begin by just emphasizing that water is such a finite resource. Without water, without addressing water under SDG 6, we cannot address any SDG at all. And I want to begin my remarks with a very poignant African proverb that says that where water is the boss, the land must obey. And I think it really emphasizes the critical role that water plays in shaping communities' livelihoods, particularly the lives of young people, where they are heavily affected by water security and conflict. And I really like to also move back to what Barbara was saying about the interplay between corruption and conflict and climate change. I think that that interplay presents such a complex challenge. And as someone from the climate background, I really feel like climate change itself is a multiple threat, a threat multiplier. It exacerbates water security, corruption, undermining effective governance, resource management, and it leads to increased conflict over resources. And I think that the connection itself between water-related conflict and climate risk is very pronounced on the African continent, where we see that the impacts of climate change exacerbate existing vulnerabilities, particularly among youth. And to go back to that frame of thinking on climate change, conflict, and armed conflict, we really see that young people in this space are the ones who really bear the brunt. And in this situation, climate change renders itself as a threat multiplier, where there is intensified food, energy security, insecurity, and it propels competition over natural resources. Right now, I'm attending a discussion on Africa's common position on climate risk and on climate peace and security. And I want to also add that we see in the African climate security risk assessment that there is a very intricate relationship between climate change, water security, and conflict. In fact, the key aspects of climate risks exacerbate water security, water scarcity. And I want to illustrate this by giving you this very key quote, that children under the age of 15, that children die from a lack of safe water than violence itself. I'm going to repeat that again. And this is according to UNICEF. In conflict-affected countries, more children die from lack of safe water than violence itself. And obviously, this is because in these situations, you are likely to have children dying from diarrheal diseases caused by lack of safe water, sanitation, and hygiene than direct violence. And I think that really emphasizes the point I'm making, that in this situation, children and youth are the ones who bear the brunt. In cases of water and armed conflict, it is children. And not only that, particularly young girls. Young girls are exposed to physical dangers, health risks associated with carrying heavy containers. And don't even get me started on the impact of water and armed conflict on the lives of girls and the reproductive health of girls. And I think in addition, this is maybe an aspect that tends to be avoided. Water-related conflict really disrupts the opportunities that are available for young people, particularly the educational opportunities. Young girls would miss schools in order to, again, have access to water, lack of sanitation in schools. And this cycle of disruption contributes to long-term socioeconomic disadvantages for young people. And I think in a continent like Africa, where 60% of the population is under 25, interplay of water insecurity really exacerbates these challenges. And I think it also, in many ways, limits the point of participation in resolving the issue of water inaccessibility. Again, that compounded by climate risks, it really poses significant challenges for African youth. And I think in addressing these issues, it's very critical that we address this in an integrated manner, where we consider the impacts of climate change on water resources. We promote sustainable water management, empower young people to participate in decision-making processes across all boards, whether it be in climate change, in peace and security, and in water. And I think the most critical point of interaction should be for us to really get down to the root of addressing the cause of water scarcity and conflict. And I think it's possible to enhance resilience and prospects for young people across the continent and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hauhelo. And I'll pick up from where you left off, which is acknowledging youth and women, young people, young girls' agency in actually contributing to effective solutions to water challenges that we face. And that's acknowledging also the multifaceted dimension of threats, which exponentially affect youth in areas of youth and children in areas of conflict. Now I'll turn to Julia. Julia, we have heard already from Barbara, Akisa, and Hauhelo. So you have the honor coming as the last contributor for the opening remarks to basically frame the conversation based on the position that you hold within the CNA, having dealt with a lot of strategy as well, and focusing on water diplomacy. So over to you, Julia.
Great, thank you very much. My background's a little different, so I will shift gears a little bit, but I think it's a nice thing to wrap up with. So I'm a researcher at a research organization that supports the Department of Defense on national security issues. A lot of what we do is data-based research and analytic tools to support decision-making. Some of you may know of our Military Advisory Board, which was started in 2007 and coined the term climate change as a threat multiplier. Starting with this effort, the question of better understanding the relationship between climate change and, of course, water stress as a piece of that. and the relationship to instability and conflict globally has been really at the crux of our research. And then taking that understanding and translating it into information that decision makers can use is one of our key objectives as well. So that's really what I'm here to talk about, data tools, and give you an example of a current data tool to help better understand these complex dynamics that we've heard about in all the other panels. So kind of getting very quickly to water stress, because I'm looking at the clock, which for this, I'm just generally referring to lack of water due to quality or quantity. It is, of course, caused or exacerbated in many cases by climate change, right? We all are familiar with, I think, the phrase water as the tip of the spear for climate change. We've heard today that conflict and instability around water do occur. They occur in different parts of the world. They play out in different conflict types. And as Madame Bahri mentioned, the number of water conflicts globally is increasing. The data clearly shows that from the Pacific Institute from year to year, and particularly in certain regions of the world, right, such as the Middle East, Africa, the Indo-Pacific region, and other parts of the world that we've heard about today. Recently, across the US government, it's become clear that there's a consensus that there's a dearth of data-based decision support tools, right, to help decision makers allocate resources, specifically across what we call the 3Ds, defense, development, and diplomacy, to address water conflict, right? And of course, climate conflict more broadly. And this is particularly true at the operational and planning levels, right? So while there are great tools already out there for analyzing the impacts of climate change, there are great projections, there's great modeling, they often don't present the findings in ways that can be easily integrated into planning and coordination among the many stakeholders, right? At times, the data can be behind the outputs of the tools isn't entirely transparent because it's maybe very complex, but not transparent in a way that allows for action or development officers, excuse me, or people in charge of programming to make the case that a particular dynamic is at play in a particular location and requires a specific response, right? So kind of giving folks who make those kinds of decisions the level of understanding that they can then make the case for a particular intervention or program or so on and so forth. So my organization has partnered with the United States Institute of Peace in recent years to develop a tool that's kind of aimed at doing this, right? It's meant to be open source, research-based. It's intended for a broad range of stakeholders, to include the US government, local governments, NGOs, and so on and so forth. So any entity that might coordinate in the field to address or respond to climate or water-driven conflict, right? So that everybody's more or less working off the same sheet of music. So that's kind of the conceptual idea behind this tool that we're developing. And really the idea is, can we identify where there is either current existing conflict or identify emerging risk of climate-related conflict in a way that's transparent, right? So the theory is explained, the data sources are clear, the process for identifying risk is clearly articulated so that users understand the range of factors. So we're in the second year of development, but one of the key pieces to the development of the tool was to spend a lot of time doing the background research to articulate the various pathways and connections, right? So how does climate change and water lead to conflict, right? It's very easy to make the jump from one to the other based on kind of human logic, but really let's try to get into the weeds of this, right? So our basic logic is kind of laid out in this image, and really our work led to, kind of a conditions-based approach where you look at a given location and take into consideration 3 basic categories of conditions, right? So these are kind of the conflict fragility conditions. Corruption is certainly among those. It also looks at kind of what are the enduring or acute climate shocks and stressors at play, and then also captures kind of government responses, whether helpful or unhelpful, that kind of give rise to specific conflict drivers, right? And then you see in the third column, our research really identified 5 clear climate-related conflict types, one of which is clearly water stress, right? And then from there, we articulate in greater detail kind of what type or form that conflict could be, ranging from kind of very local, instability, protests, kind of all the way up a conflict escalation scale to something that would look more like an interstate conflict or kind of major geopolitical conflict, such as what's taking place in Russia and the Ukraine. You can see that that is kind of our big logic chain behind the tool, our framework. If we could go to the next slide, please, that would be great. Just to go down one more level, we kind of articulate two clear types of water conflicts right now. This tool is meant to be developed and built on over time as we learn more about what these dynamics are. But right now,
can you please wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Yep. So yes, that's so we just have transboundary conflict and freshwater conflict, which is more kind of localized conflict. So really, I just wanted to give you a sense of kind of what this tool looks like. I'd love to take questions and feedback into it. You know, the idea again is to really provide people who are responsible for interventions and programming and so on and so forth, to either prevent or address conflict or better understand why current conflict is enduring and try to factor the climate and water piece into it in ways that perhaps haven't always been done, and giving folks the tools to be able to do that. So I will stop there, and I'm eager to take any questions, comments, or feedbacks. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks for actually sharing that very fascinating framework, which allows us, in fact, to better understand early warning around potential water conflicts, but also navigate towards effective solutions which are embedded in the policy landscape as well. Although, of course, looking at your presentation side by side, Barbara's, there are clearly questions around power dynamics involved. There are clearly questions about the disparity between rules and the application of rules as well, which we can delve into. At this point, I would normally abuse my privilege as chair, but I'd like to look to the audience to take 2 questions for the panelists, so that I would then use those 2 questions to allow them frame their final remarks as well. So I'm looking at the audience to see if there are any hands raised. And Ludmila and Martin, if you could help me as well identify any individuals who might want to ask questions. There are no questions on the chat. And 1, 2, 3, okay. So I would like to basically, I can see a question on the chat directed at Akisa. You say the Israeli Defense Forces have systematically destroyed Palestinian pipelines. Could you explain how Israel has systematically destroyed Gaza's water network and weaponized war? That question is directed at Akisa. So distinguished panelists, audience, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to seize this moment to actually give our panelists a minute and a half, actually 90 seconds, to provide closing their closing argument. Barbara, you spoke about the vicious triangle, corruption, conflict, and climate change. I would like you to inject a dimension about the pervasive nature of global capital in water crisis, as well as it ties in to corruption in your closing remarks. Akisa, I mean, you have a question already directed towards the situation in Gaza, but I'd like you to take a step back and think through possible solutions or effective ways to address this humanitarian crisis, given the fact that there is gridlock at the moment. What are concrete ways in which youth can organize to address these issues? You have 90 seconds. And Julia, my question to you would be, how do we navigate? How do we lower barriers for entry into effective early warning responses to early warning signs to conflict, to potential water conflict? So you all have 90 seconds, after which I'll invite Des again to do the mop-up before we take it away. So Barbara, over to you.
Thanks, Fontaine. That's a hell of a one to try and deal with in 90 seconds. But yes, maybe there are 4 C's, and the challenge of what you call global capital, which has benefits and disbenefits. But I want to refer to the challenge of consumerism and the consumerism of middle class, but of the North in particular, and what that has in terms of implications for water security in the South, in terms of really creating situations of overuse of water scarcity, etc., in the South, in order to provide for the consumers' needs of the North and the growing South middle class, which then exacerbates the issue of water scarcity, and therefore exacerbates the issue of conflict over water as well. It's an enormous topic to take on. There is a program called the Fair Water Footprints that is trying to look precisely at this issue of the imbalance, of the power imbalance that you referred to, Fonte, in your comments, and this imbalance between and this sucking of water and resources from the South to the North and leaving conflict in its wake.
Thank you.
Yeah, much more to be said, but I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. We have the opportunity to build upon that. Akisa, over to you.
Yeah, it is not only during the war with Gaza that Israel and the IDF has been, destroying all the water infrastructure, but it is a system. It has been done systematically, and it has been reported. During all the wars, that 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, systematically damage, destruction of wells, of reservoir, pumping stations, sewage treatment plants, the desalination plants, and so on, the water pipes, everything has been destroyed. And it has been said, we will cut, and they have cut off the supplies of water, since October. So it has been really, a target. And this is why we talk about weaponizing water. It has been really a target, and people have no more, water to drink. Even before, it was limited. Up to now, it was about, I think it is less than 1.5 liter per person. So it is really, water was a target. It has been systematically, and it has been more. And even in the West Bank, sometimes some of the wells have been filled with concrete and so on. So it was, on purpose. Now, the question is how we address this kind of issue, because we are really, the conflict that we are seeing in Gaza is at another scale. We are not used to such and especially targeting civilians and targeting, which, all this infrastructure, which is a war crime. It's really a genocide and a war crime. So the question is how, because, we have to have, and we think that water can play a role. And it is because water is a political resource that we have to look at, how to bring people together and not to look only to the top of the iceberg about.
Thank you very much, Akisa.
But
thank
also
you for
to look at all
underlining.
this question of identity, I think, equity and trust, and really that is what's more important. It will take time, but I'm hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for underlining water as a tool of war, but also the intangibles, which is social relational in actually overcoming them. Hello, over to you.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to how young people can really play a role in the water space, I think firstly, it has to start at home. In your communities, there is a lot that young people can spearhead at local level, particularly for communities that are underserved. There is a lot of opportunity. I think with the growth of digital technologies as well, there is an opportunity for young innovators in particular to develop portable solutions to monitor water data and strengthen resilience and all of those things. But I think the most important thing when it comes to the water sector and the climate space as well is relationships. Without fostering collaboration and dialogue with key stakeholders like local government, private sector, civil society, there is no way that we can facilitate peace and actually play a pivotal role in this field. So I would say that those are my key ones. And also being in these spaces where you can contribute to dialogue on water as well, and organizing young people amongst themselves.
Thank you, hello, for underlining the necessity to organize. and youth tech innovation while connecting different spaces from the local all the way to the national. Julia, over to you.
Yeah, I think just in terms of some closing thoughts related to my presentation, I think data tools can be very powerful, right, in helping us understand and highlight key dynamics that can support decisions and responses. But when it comes to kind of the complexity of the issues that we're talking about and the fact that it's something that's quite dynamic and changing in real time and becoming more intense is one word, more widespread, right, in different parts of the world over time. Tools, and data and so on and so forth are so important in helping people understand and educating, right, people all the way down to the average person on the street on the importance of these issues, right, and that can stretch all the way up to government leaders, national leaders, and so on and so forth. So, I don't think the data tools solve problems. They're not going to be a panacea to any of these things, but continuing to invest and develop them, I think is so key to all the things that we're talking about here. So that's my final pitch. Thank you.
Fantastic, Julia. Ending up on a rather optimistic note, even if you're modest about the capacity for data tools. Des, again, the honor comes to you to mop up. And my parting shot is the world has never been wealthier, yet more unequal, which is a key point which Barbara spoke to. Over to you, Des, again.
Thank you, Fonte, and thank you, panel. You have been brilliant, and you've given a wonderful kickstart to the seminar series. And just a reminder to folk, next step is unpacking the social and humanitarian dimension in a lot more detail later today. And then tomorrow, we have a session around engaging the economic impacts and bring this all together. So please, organize to be part of that. You are most welcome, and the links are available on the SIWI site. Just a few closing remarks around this one, and this is by no means a summary because I don't think that's possible. The first is to make the point that water conflict is never accidental. It has intent, it has purpose. Sometimes the consequences are not thought through completely. Sometimes they are. And I think we must be alive to that. The second thing that really needs to be emphasized around this is in the way we've been talking for many decades about water as a building block for development, as an enabler of organizing to be in a more equitable world. It is similarly true around peace and security matters, that water as a tool for peace and security and stability is one of extremely high potential. The third issue that I want to engage here is that what you have done outside the design, and I'm really delighted by this, is you've given meaning to that algorithm of what a threat multiplier can actually mean. And you popped in a couple of tools in that toolbox on how we can take this to the next level of understanding in an independent scientific way before it gets clouded over by the political interpretation. And then the last 2 points I want to make is, one, water as a driver to catalyze the global agreements that already exist must really be used. We have tenets around basic needs. We have tenets around human rights, and water as an expression of realizing that with a multiplier effect positively way beyond that is absolutely critical. And the last point I want to make is the test point in the world is what it means for vulnerable people. I mean, Jorge talked about the youth specifically, but there are other vulnerable groups as well. And those vulnerable groups are at the very bottom, the sliver at the bottom of the pyramid around support and realization of rights. When we can expand that, this is when we are on the right road. There are many, many conversations that come out of the chat today. Please go on with it. We want this to be a vibrant conversation in every theater that you have, and all theaters matter. While it might be difficult to engage with these macro theaters of conflict that we spoke about today, and there are many others, It is true that you can start in your backyard, however you define that backyard, to make the differences that matter as we incrementally broker our way to a higher peace asset, as opposed to weaponization being a political asset for other gains. So thank you all very much indeed. Looking forward to the engagement in the next 2 sessions, and a special thanks to this panel. You really have been brilliant. Thank you so much. And the moderator, for your dynamism and agility around jumping around the program. Please be sure it was a deliberate test and you have passed. Thank you all very much.